Eskom, one of the biggest polluters in South Africa, say installing the technology needed to meet stricter emissions rules could take up to 20 years. The new emissions rules are expected to come into effect in April. Eskom has applied for some of the rules to be postponed, suspended or adjusted for some of its coal-fired power plants. So for more on this, I'm joined in studio now by attorney Timothy Lloyd from the Centre for Environmental Rights. Timothy, thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Fair, thank you for having me.
Let's talk a little bit about the impact, because I think that a lot of times when we have a conversation around environmental issues, it almost appears as though societies remains quite aloof, or not necessarily in line with what's exactly what it means and how is it that it actually affects them. So Eskom, biggest polluter, certainly in the South African context. Tell us about the importance of even having these kinds of conversations around limiting the emissions.
Fair, thank you very much. And I think that's one of the key points, is that this is so much more than an environmental issue.
That's it.
So these minimum emission standards, which were promulgated by government in 2010, for those viewers who haven't seen an ENCA segment on this issue before, are really our national air pollution limits that apply to a number of different industries, including Eskom's power stations, and it regulates very specific pollutants that are emitted from these operations, each of which have their own health impacts on communities around them, society in general. And the reason for these MES, and it's in their title, is that we need to control these pollutants because they have, or are expected to have, a significant detrimental effect, not only on the environment, but people's health, social conditions, economic conditions, even
like
cultural heritage.
Diseases.
Correct. So that's one of them, respiratory chronic cardiovascular diseases. It's also known to contribute to things more severe, such as cancer.
Okay, so then on the other side of it, Eskom is saying that, listen, this could take up to 20 years, but most importantly, this is within a budget that we probably don't even have. So how then do you start responding to that?
So this is Eskom's fifth application since 2014 to delay compliance with the minimum emission standards. How they were set up is there were 2015 limits set for existing plants at the time, including most of Eskom's coal-fired power stations, which were more lenient, and then allowed for a transition period to April 2020, so April this year, for stricter limits to kick in. Now, since 2014, Eskom has kicked this issue down the road to address it at a later point. And Life After Coal, it's the joint campaign that Centre for Environmental Rights are part of. We are once again opposing their latest application, which revolves around two coal-fired power stations. That's Medupi and Matimba coal-fired power stations up in the Limpopo near Lepelale. And it's really the first stage of that application. It's called the background information document. And what this deals with is Eskom's attempt to apply for what are called alternative limits, or weaker limits than what are set out in these stricter 2020 standards.
Yeah.
And for Medupi, it's applying to do so from 2020 to 2030. It wants to apply for a limit that's 8 times weaker than the 2020 limit that's meant to kick in. And then from 2030 to the decommissioning of Medupi, which is 2064, so that's 44 years from now, it wants to basically be exempt and again have to comply with a much weaker standard than what we see.
Timothy, I hear you. I'm going to take on the other side of it and allow me to play devil's advocate for a little bit, because as much as we can have the conversation of life after coal, but I think that for somebody that is listening, watching and thinking, life after coal, what impact does life after coal have on miners, because that impacts on the mining industry? What impact does life after coal have on the unemployment rate or the employment rate thereof? What impact does life after coal have on the ability to diversify, privatize, but that also that diversification, privatization comes with a price, and the price is often the people on the ground who just want to feed their families. So as much as I hear you in terms of we need to become more innovative and environmentally conscious, because it's going to affect the very same people that we're trying to employ, but many of them will turn around and say, rather the devil that we know, especially when it comes to life after coal, I'd rather work with coal and know that I've got job security, as opposed to now get into a conversation of life after coal for the purpose of environmental adherence, and then have to deal with the fact that actually I may not even have a job, so what's the point of life after coal in the first place? How do you respond to that?
So I think the first point is it's not one or the other. As I said, it's not solely an environmental issue here, it's actually a public health issue, people's socio-economic development as well. This does implicate a range of human rights that are enshrined in our constitution. And maybe to revert back to the Life After Coal objectives as a campaign, the first is to discourage investment in new coal-fired power stations and mines. The second is to ensure that current coal facilities comply with the law and are retired gradually. And then both those objectives work towards enabling this just transition to a renewable energy system for the people of South Africa. So the reality is that at least half of Eskom's fleet of coal-fired power stations are reaching the end of lives, meaning that they need to be decommissioning. And something that we are promoting and calling for when addressing government is that this decommissioning process, as part of this just transition to energy mix that's got more renewable energy in the mix, is a very inclusive and transparent process, both for the employees of mines and coal-fired power stations, so those employed by Eskom, and for the communities that have become dependent and have established themselves around these coal-fired power stations. There need to be support mechanisms for these communities, for these individuals, in terms of retraining, recapacitating, and provided with alternatives, both in terms of economic opportunity and just better social development. Clearly, the status quo is not working at the moment. Business as usual really isn't acceptable anymore. So we need to be looking at the next era in South Africa, really. And I think now that we've entered this next decade, it's a very good time to reassess, reflect, and plan this transition led by government.
Timothy, we're going to leave it there. Unfortunately, we've run out of time with this conversation, but it's a very insightful one. One would say that South Africa, we get it right when it comes to concept documents and litigation. We get it wrong when it comes to implementation and those that are supposed to actually implement. So hopefully from your mouth to the ears that need to hear it the most. Timothy, thanks for joining us this afternoon, shedding some light in terms of exactly what does new technology bring on the table, especially when it comes to environmental consciousness that leads then to the ability for you to stay healthy in general as a result of the gas emissions.